They reached the Rubicon, huh? Like Julius Caesar, yeah. Yeah, okay, well, the other direction, but still. So, alle jacta est, huh? The die is cast. What? The die was cast more than 5 years ago. A long way from the Rubicon. Oh, true. Yeah, okay. Bye. September 30th, 1944. Joseph Stalin is pretty hardcore, right? I mean, he doesn't take anything from anybody. But you meet with him, and you tell him straight off that you will accept his help, but whatever happens, you are still in charge. And he actually says, okay, you are Marshal Tito. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Allies launched the ambitious Operations Market Garden to hit the German rear and try to destroy a bunch of Dutch bridges, but it was in danger of failure by week's end. In Italy, they did manage to take Rimini and San Marino, though. The fighting in the South Pacific on Peleliu was close and bloody. The Soviets took Tallinn in the north and made plans to enter Yugoslavia in the south, and the Finns signed an armistice with the Soviets. There's fighting this week in Finland at Tornio and Kemi as the German withdrawal turns ugly, but the Finns are successful in both places, though the Germans decide they will now destroy whatever they can on their journey out of the country. We also saw last week the Estonians try to set up their own government ahead of the advancing Red Army. Otto Tief's administration lasted just a few days. They disband, and most of them will be captured by the Soviets, including Tief, who will be arrested October 10th and will be sentenced to the Gulag. The Soviets by now have pretty much cleared mainland Estonia. So on the 29th, units from Leonid Govorov's Leningrad front begin the Moonsund operation to take the West Estonian Archipelago. The first beachhead is at Kuivastu on Muhu or Moon Island. That is the 109th and 8th Estonian Rifle Corps. A lot of these guys are Estonians who were conscripted by the Red Army as it advanced through Estonia. So a whole bunch of them do not really have much or any combat training. The Germans will withdraw from Moon to Ursel or Saaremaa Island and destroy the causeway between the two. They also bring their troops to Ursel from Dago or Hiiumaa and bring in an infantry division and a Luftwaffe field division as reinforcements. But a bit further south, there's kind of a race going on in Latvia and Lithuania, a race between the Germans and the Soviets to set up a new solid front line after all the recent fighting. I'll cover that next week. There is plenty more fighting to cover this week. On the 27th, there is heavy fighting around Cluj near the Hungarian border. Okay, last week, Rodion Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front tried to break into northern Transylvania and get into the rear of the units fighting against Ivan Petrov's 4th Ukrainian Front. But by midweek, it is obvious that this plan isn't going to work. But that's just his right flank. His left flank took Arad the 21st. That was the 53rd Army, 18th Tank Corps, and 1st Romanian Army. And now on the 24th, the Soviet-Romanian forces reached the border at Mako. Malinovsky wants to stop to reinforce and get more supplies, since his front has been in action for 77 straight days and has very much outpaced its supply lines. Stavka, though, says keep up the pressure with the center and the right, and then begin the Debrecen operation next week on the 6th. That operation is to send 46th Army and 1st Romanian Army on a drive towards Budapest, while the rest of his forces attack from near Oradea towards Debrecen. Ideally, their spearheads will link up and surround the enemy. However, German Army Group South Commander Johannes Friesner has new orders as well from Adolf Hitler. He is to send Armeegruppe Fretter Pico, a German-Hungarian force, to attack south past Oradea, then go along the rim of the mountains and trap the Soviets north of them. After mopping them up, they could then just have a winter defense line, a tough one, in the mountains. But what's going on in Romania itself, now a couple of weeks after the armistice with the USSR? Well, I mentioned the articles of the armistice that allowed the Soviets to requisition pretty much everything they wanted, and the chaos from that is now slowly subsiding. But in terms of politics, the Russians quickly demonstrated their suspicions of the historic parties and the nationalist leaders, while the Communist Party, its ranks swelled with a horde of place-seekers, collaborationists, and men on the run from the Iron Guard, began to flex its muscles. Anna Pauker's achievement was the creation of a vastly expanded party, though it was one bloated with elements which only weeks earlier had manned or supported the Antonescu dictatorship. The same thugs, secret policemen, and soldiers swelled with the riffraff signed up by the new communist leadership. Anna Pauker, in case you wonder, is a Romanian communist leader. She was actually exiled in the mid-1920s after an arrest and eventually spent time in Moscow at the International Lenin School. Returning to Romania in the mid-30s, she was again arrested and tried together with other leading communists in a big hullabaloo of a trial. She was given 10 years. She did not serve 10 years, but in 1941 was sent to the USSR in a prisoner exchange. There, she became the leader of the Romanian communists in exile, and boy, is she now back. But there are a lot of reactionary and anti-Soviet elements around in Romania. I mean, how could there not be? They were fighting against the Soviets a month ago. They were allied with the Axis. The press, the schools, many senior officers. Well, reports of real and imagined opposition abound and grow. As for the very real opposition in Warsaw to German control, the uprising there is still in progress. On the 24th, German units reinforced by 19th Panzer Division fight their way into Mokotów, and many insurgents must withdraw through the sewers once more. But this time, the Germans are ready, blocking many off and throwing gas grenades into others when Poles are making their escape, killing hundreds of them. By the 25th, the Germans control the whole western bank of the Vistula. And the 26th, they move against the last big pockets of resistance in Mokotów and Żoliborz. That day comes one of the last airdrops, but the insurgents are pretty much confined to sewers and basements and don't really have open space to receive drops. The last drop of all is the 29th. 306 Allied planes total have flown over Warsaw during the uprising, with crews from Britain, the US, Poland, and South Africa. 41 have been shot down and over 200 airmen killed. The 27th, the insurgents in Mokotów surrender. The Germans next focus on Żoliborz in the north of the city and the Campinos forest to the west. There doesn't seem to be much hope left for the uprising. The Slovaks are still fighting their Slovak national uprising as well this week. As the first German rush into Slovakia was held, the rebel front contracted and the revolt was largely confined to central Slovakia, where the defense system was quickly reorganized. But this still did not solve the problem of the regular military forces and the partisans fighting under what amounted to separate commands. But the arrival this week of Colonel Osmolov puts the Slovak partisans under direct Soviet command. Meanwhile, Kirill Moskalenko's 38th Army is finally making some headway in the Carpathians at the Dukla Pass, trying to break through and reach the insurgents. I mentioned last week Yugoslavian partisan leader Josip Broz Tito meeting with Joseph Stalin in Moscow. The meeting goes over details of a combined Soviet-Yugoslav operation and what sort of aid the Soviets will give to the Yugoslav partisans. But things do not go the way Stalin wants them to go, as Tito tells him firmly that the Red Army is not going to enter Yugoslavia and suddenly bring all anti-German or anti-Axis forces under its command. No, sir. So, on the 28th, a public statement is issued in Moscow about the Soviet request for temporary entry of Soviet troops into Yugoslav territory. It says that the Soviets will leave once the operational goals have been achieved. It says that the Soviets accept that the regions they have troops in will still be under Yugoslav civil control, and the partisans are to remain under Tito's direct control. At the actual meeting, apparently Soviet bigwigs like Beria and Molotov are astonished by the way Tito talks back to Stalin and flat out refuses his advice, like taking back King Peter. Thing is, the Soviet advance has already begun. On the 28th, 75th Corps is at the border, and Sergei Gorshkov's gunboats, the Danube Flotilla, are heading for Negotin, which falls today as the week ends. This is the first objective, so the path into the country is open. But also today, Tito sends out a message to his First Army Group to not begin the Belgrade operation without his specific authorization. One operation that comes to a close this week is Market Garden. Well, it's actually two operations, Market and Garden, but still. On the 24th, elements of 30th Corps reached the south bank of the Rhine west of Arnhem. Other 30th Corps units entered Germany south of Nijmegen. However, as last week ended, the situation in the Arnhem airborne perimeter was not good. Since enemy attacks relentlessly continued, casualties mounted and ammunition was starting to run out. The 43rd Wessex Division, attached to 30th Corps, was trying to reach them, but the single road had been cut by the enemy, so that was going very, very slowly. 30th Corps Commander Brian Horrocks still thinks they can use the airborne bridgehead as a base for attacks as the week gets going, hence the 43rd moving to cross downriver and attack west of Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem, and the 4th Dorsets do try a nighttime river crossing. They only manage to get 315 men across, and though they fight their way to the high ground and hold it briefly, they are driven off and lose 142 casualties that night, including their commander Gerald Tilley, who is captured. Horrocks' assessment of the situation was at odds with reality. The perimeter was on the verge of being overwhelmed, and common sense dictated that the airborne forces would have to be pulled out. 2nd Army Commander Miles Dempsey meets with Airborne Corps Commander Frederick Browning, and they decide to evacuate the perimeter, and they give the order to pull out. Operation Berlin is to bring the paratroopers back across the river by night. The morning of the 25th, the Paras get the news from their commander, Roy Urquhart. But a withdrawal while still in close contact with the enemy is really tricky. You absolutely need deception, and you can't let them know until the last possible moment that you're pulling out. Urquhart and his staff made meticulous arrangements to keep their enemy in the dark. The plan proposed that all along the perimeter, groups of men would be gradually pulled out, whilst a few others kept up constant fire to deceive the enemy. Starting from the north, piece by piece, the line was gradually to be emptied of troops and shortened. Men would then be passed down to the riverbank onto boats following a strict timetable. Doctors and medical orderlies, together with the wounded, would have to stay behind. Well, that gets going at 9 p.m. with a supporting barrage from 43rd Division and 30th Corps. The action is during heavy rainfall and strong winds, which does help to conceal movement, and Canadian engineers pilot the motorboats that can carry 14 men each. But the Germans can still see the boats crisscrossing back and forth over the Rhine. They think it's a reinforcement, not an evacuation, but that doesn't matter because they hit the boats with mortars and machine guns, and by the time dawn approaches, most of them have been destroyed. Daylight makes any further evacuation impossible, and that is it for the last stand of the British 1st Airborne Division with some of the Polish 1st Parachute Brigade. Urquhart had a force of 10,000 men. Of that, 2,163 British Paras, 160 Polish, and also 75 of the Dorsets crossed the river this night and escaped. He's had nearly 1,200 men killed and 6,642 of that original 10,000 wounded, captured, or missing, a loss of nearly 80%. 30th Corps' northward thrust has now also left the Allies with a big salient which the Germans are going to try to eliminate. At Nijmegen, the 43rd Wessex and US 82nd Airborne Divisions are going to have to fight to hold the area between the Meuse and the Lower Rhine. This brings 21st Army Group Commander Bernard Montgomery's quick series of advances to a halt. The war will not be over by Christmas. 2nd Army cannot drive to the north. They must turn east towards the Ruhr and the Rhine and the stout defenses there. The Rhineland is forested as well. There will also be a return to Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower's original plan of advance along a very broad front with all of the armies in contact with the enemy in unison, so no one is going to make a special advance or get extra resources. Whose fault then is the failure of Market Garden? Well, that can't help but sit on Montgomery's shoulders. But during the rout in France and Belgium early in the month, it had sure seemed possible, but by the 17th when it was launched, it kinda didn't anymore. Trying to get all the way to the Arnhem Bridge certainly looks like overreaching. Hindsight, but still. And the distance between the British drop zone and their bridge was a very poor decision in hindsight. A whole Panzer Corps resting up right near Arnhem, again, which Monty knew of, is a huge factor in the defeat, and even just the presence of Walter Model to guide the German response locally was a big deal, as was expecting 30th Corps to be able to just power up the single road to Arnhem. Still, there were some impressive feats, particularly by both the British and American airborne, and they did manage to capture the north side of the bridge at least, but well, too many moving parts. 30th Corps goes over to defense as 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions attack them on Betuwe, or the island, between the Meuse, the Waal, and the lower Rhine rivers. A big German counterattack against the Nijmegen salient begins the 30th, but goes nowhere that day. To be fair, they're still getting organized, and they brought in the 12th SS Corps and what's left of the 2nd Fallschirm Corps to support the SS Panzers, so they will soon try again. Elsewhere in the west, on the 27th, U.S. 2nd Corps attacks the outer defenses of Metz. On the 25th, Canadian 3rd Division attacks Calais, and today, the German garrison there surrenders. The Allied advances are continuing this week in Italy, though slowly. British 8th Army, after crossing the Marecchia last week, is now on the flat terrain of Romagna. This, it was hoped, would lead to a swift breakthrough of the German defenses. There were, however, a series of factors mitigating against this. It was soon discovered that the Romagna plain was unsuitable for tanks. The lack of observation points made the use of artillery difficult, while the many rivers, streams, and irrigation ditches had flood banks standing 15 to 30 meters above the fields, suitable for defense, but not for attack. When not used for defense, the banks were destroyed by the Germans, flooding the fields and making them impassable for tanks. Heavy rains contributed to the flooding, and the weather greatly impeded air observation and support. The attackers have also taken pretty heavy casualties the past month. Still, the next phase of battle begins with the New Zealand 2nd Division crossing the Uso the 26th and then reaching the Rubicon the next day. British 56th Division, relieving the 1st Armored Division, who have fought their last action, also reaches the Rubicon, but they cannot cross it. The drive further west by U.S. 349th and 351st Regiments towards Imola continues this week, seizing a few peaks until they reach Monte Battaglia. Very serious fighting develops there the last few days of the week, and though even early next week, the Allies will still hold it, the inadequate road stiff enemy defense causes U.S. 5th Army Commander Mark Clark to call this drive off and focus on Bologna. Also in Italy this week, on the 26th, the Caserta Agreement is signed between the British, the Greek government under Georgios Papandreou, and representatives from EAM, ELAS, and EDES. Under this agreement, all Greek partisan forces are now considered to be part of the Greek armed forces and fall under the command of British General Ronald Scobie. The security battalions are now called instruments of the enemy and will be treated as hostile forces if they do not surrender. No partisan group will try to seize power in Greece between the departure of the Axis and the arrival of the Greek government and the British armed forces. The Greek situation in general is covered in more depth in our War Against Humanity series, so check that out. There's some more news from various commands this week to cover. On the 26th, Adolf Hitler signs a decree establishing a People's Army to defend German home soil. This will conscript all able-bodied men between 16 and 60. Later that same day, Heinrich Himmler also comes for a visit. He has with him 160 pages the Gestapo found at Army headquarters in Sowden, south of Berlin. This bombshell series of papers implicates Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the former chief of the Abwehr, German military intelligence service, in plots against Hitler going back to the very start of the war. Also implicated is his deputy Hans Oster and another staffer Hans von Dohnanyi, whom the Gestapo will call the spiritual head of the conspiracy against Hitler. Interestingly enough, Georg Hansen, Canaris' successor at the Abwehr, called Canaris the spiritual instigator of the July 20th assassination plot. And for his part in it, Hansen was executed this month on the 8th. Canaris was arrested already in July, and Dohnanyi already in April on foreign currency violation charges. It seems that he transferred funds to a Swiss bank on behalf of Jews he had saved and helped flee from Germany to Switzerland. Oster was also arrested in July, the day after the plot. You can learn a whole lot more about these guys and their activities throughout the war on our Spies and Ties series about the intelligence war. Over in Burma and China, another command situation is further developing. I talked again last week about the huge friction between Chiang Kai-shek and Vinegar Joe Stilwell, which has pretty much reached the breaking point. Stilwell was overjoyed that American President Franklin Roosevelt issued what was basically an ultimatum that Chiang must defer to Stilwell as Supreme Theater Commander. Chiang does not take that lying down. This week on the 25th, his official request for Stilwell to be recalled is sent to Washington. At this point, though, Chiang is worried that even with Stilwell gone, his position would be shaky. By forcing Chinese troops to participate in the Lido Road campaign, the Allies had distracted attention from the real threat, the massive incursions into central China that had come with Ishigo. The American general seemed oblivious to the damage he had caused. He set to work on a plan for communist troops to be brought into an overall national command structure in which they would report to Chiang through him. In return, the CCP would receive 5 divisions worth of equipment and supplies, and the right to deploy troops north of the Yellow River. More on developments on that as they happen. Several thousand kilometers southeast from there are developments now in the fighting on Peleliu. As the week begins, the Japanese managed to reinforce Colonel Nakagawa with nearly a battalion of men. Faced with the prospect of further such reinforcements, the Americans prioritized securing the north of the island over the Umabrogo Mountains. So by the 25th, the 5th Marines are before the row of limestone hills on the northeastern peninsula, and the 2nd Battalion is to assault them. What the 2nd of the 5th did not know was that they were facing the most comprehensive cave system on Peleliu, which was the underground home of the Japanese naval construction units. There are like 1,500 men defending these hills, and there's heavy fighting the 25th and 26th. After that, the Marines have secured the north shore of the island, though only over ground. It will likely take weeks for them to eliminate all subterranean resistance there. By the 29th, the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines have also secured Nyesbus and Kongaru Islands. This cuts Peleliu off from being reinforced by any of the other Palau Islands. Today, General William Rupertus declares, "Organized resistance has ended on Nyesbus and all of northern Peleliu has been secured." Which isn't really true, but all of Peleliu except the Umabrogo Mountains is mostly in American hands. And that brings me to the end of the week. With Germans on the move in Finland, Soviets on the move in the Baltics, and Romania, and Hungary, and now Yugoslavia, and the Americans in Peleliu, the Allies in general in Italy, but the failure of Market Garden in the West. I'm going to play the blame game a little more to end today. Well, I'll let William Buckingham, who wrote a very detailed book about the operation called Arnhem, do that. He details the planning and leadership flaws, with particular attention to 1st Airborne Commander Roy Urquhart, a Monty protege promoted to his position with exactly 0 experience ever leading paratroopers. And as Buckingham writes in an article in Military History Now, the idea that he could simply move into Arnhem after giving the Germans 24 hours notice was rooted in conventional operational procedures and fanciful at best. Urquhart also spent 48 hours cut off from his men after vacating his headquarters and cutting the phone line. But he isn't the only one who did not understand the urgency of airborne operations and their difference to the conventional. The Guards Armored Division took its own sweet time linking up with the American Airborne, following conventional practice that armor only moves in the day and stops at night. 43rd Division also took its time after crossing the wall. Now, had everyone appreciated the urgency required to have a chance of success, would there have been success? Well, who knows? But anyhow, the war will definitely be over by Christmas. Just not Christmas 1944. That series, Spies and Ties, that I mentioned about the intelligence war in this war, hosted by Astrid Deinhard, is really awesome. It is a necessary complement to these regular episodes. And you can see an episode from a couple months ago about the demise of Nazi intelligence right here, any minute now. That series and this series are both funded by the Time Ghost Army, and you can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest officers in the Army, and Andrew Moore is the Army Member of the Week. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.